you. Okay, so our first presenter is no stranger to any of us here. It is the Associate Professor of Biblical Studies here, Dr. Matthew Thomas. Dr. Thomas has, as I'm sure you all know, published and worked on a variety of really interesting and important topics. Maybe most notably, perhaps most notably, his book on Paul's works of the law in the context of second century perception. And he's going to be speaking with us today about a more recent project on First Clement. So who was Peter's first successor? That's going to be our driving question for today. So let's welcome.
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for all the work you've been involved with that also. Do we have a handout? Excellent. And then you guys see the slides here as well. There's not going to be tons of these, and so if you don't have the best field of vision, it's not going to be the biggest competitive. Although we've got a couple of things in there. So for those of you who are in the corner that really can't see, hopefully you can some way of seeing what's going on there. Our question for today is who was Peter's first successor? It's then based here on the dating of First Clement and its relevance for the earliest Roman succession. Now, this question, who was St. Peter's first successor? This should be easy, right? So, Linus. We've probably gone to church at some point in our lives. We've probably heard something like Linus, Cletus, Clement, and then you sort of forget afterwards, and sort of kind of comes after that. But we at least have those on Linus, Cletus, Clement. But did you know that there's actually two traditions? One, which puts Clement third after Peter in a linear succession, so that Clement is in the 90s, and another which puts Clement as the first successor after Peter, so in the 60s, 70s. As we will see, there is evidence for both scenarios among early testimonies, and both traditions were known through the Middle Ages. As one example from the Eastern Church in the 9th century, Photius writes as follows: some say that Clement succeeded Peter as Bishop of Rome, others that he was the fourth bishop, Linus and Cletus intervening. The evidence for both positions is sufficiently mixed that as recently as 2008, the Annuario Pontifico, which I didn't really know what that was. Do you know what that is? It's sort of the book of the popes that tells you everything you need to know about it. So, recently in 2008, the Annuario Pontifico included both possibilities in its profile of Clement, setting his pontificate between either 92 to 99 or 68 to 76 AD. In today's seminar, we're going to approach this question from an angle which has been relatively neglected and focus on one particular piece of evidence, Clement of Rome's epistle to Corinth, otherwise known as First Clement, which was written to quell a severe uprising in the Corinthian church. If we can date Clement's epistle with any greater precision, might it help us to answer the question of where Clement is most likely have fit in succession from Peter, and to solve the puzzle of the early Roman succession in general. Now, as you can imagine, the dating of this epistle is also contested along similar lines, with the two most popular dates being 95 to 96 AD or around 69 to 70 AD. While the first date in the 90s under Emperor Domitian has been the more popular view over the past century, this has begun to shift in recent decades. When I first began seriously studying this question for a book I'm writing with St. Vladimir's Popular Patristic series, my own view was that the internal evidence of First Clement supported an earlier date, while the external testimony favored the later date. My subsequent research has substantially revised these conclusions and suggested new historical connections, which I had not foreseen, which are summarized in what follows. Our seminar will proceed today in 3 sections. First, we will briefly examine the most relevant passages in First Clement, from which we might be able to discern under which of these proposed settings the epistle is more likely to have been written. Second, we will evaluate the external testimony related to when Clement is attested to have inherited the seat of Peter, and hence when First Clement is more likely to have been written. Third, You will see how the combined internal and external testimony is corroborated by points of contact with historical events that took place in Corinth in this period. Correspondences, which I only arrived at thanks to students here at DSBT. Finally, we'll conclude by evaluating what this combined evidence would suggest for our original question of who was actually Peter's first successor, briefly discuss potential alternatives and objections, and then open up the matters to you, our audience, to discuss what the possible implications might be of these proposed conclusions. First, we'll begin with the internal evidence, for which I have chosen 4 brief passages. So you have these on your handout. The first, sudden and repeated. So on account of the sudden and repeated events and misfortunes that have happened among us, brothers, we acknowledge to have slowly turned towards the matters sought out by you. The most frequently cited piece of evidence in support for a dating following a persecution under Domitian, so 95 and 96 AD, the later date, comes from the beginning of the epistle, in which Clement writes that the Roman Church's delay in responding has been due to, quote, these sudden and repeated events and misfortunes that have happened among us. A century ago, the patristic scholar J.B. Lightfoot's analysis identified this as the clearest attestation to a date in the mid-90s, which he coordinated with Eusebius's placement of Clement's episcopate in the same period. While this view held sway over much of the past century, it has now fallen out of favor for 2 primary reasons. Doubts about whether Clement's language describes a persecution, and the idea of a Domitianic persecution in general. For the first point, as Dan Batavasi's recent study notes, it seems that, quote, the vocabulary used, so sumperat eperimptoses, is too vague to indicate a persecution. Well, the terms I've translated, events and misfortunes, both often carry a negative connotation. This is not the case in every instance. It is questionable whether such terms would be fitting to describe a full-scale persecution against the church. What is clear is that the usual language for persecution, diokmos, is not used by Clement in this section. These difficulties are compounded by doubts regarding an organized persecution under Domitian. Our earliest Christian writer who attests to Domitian's opposition to the faith is Tertullian, who says as follows: Domitian too, a man of Nero's type in cruelty, tried to speed that persecution, but as he had something of the human in him, he soon put an end to what he had begun, even restoring again those whom he had banished. Whatever Domitian's attempts at persecution had been, the description of them as ephemeral fits uneasily with Clement's language, for whom the events and misfortunes in Rome are specifically described as repeated. Eusebius likewise speaks of some sort of persecution under Domitian. Yet while he writes that the emperor put some prominent Romans to death, he never mentions the death of a particular Christian. And in the primary narrative he recounts, Domitian's interrogation of the remaining relatives of Jesus, the story ends with the emperor setting the Christians free. What other repeated events and misfortunes could have served as Clement's reference, which would have delayed response from Rome and required no further elaboration? Commentators such as Edmondson and Heron have noted a natural candidate is the civil war that took place in Rome with the year of 4 emperors in 69 AD. In which the city was thrown into anarchy after Nero's death in mid-68 by the sudden and repeated assassinations of the emperor, the Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, until Vespasian finally consolidated power in early 70 AD. As Tacitus describes, this period of anarchy in Rome saw the Capitol building burned down by Rome's own people, while the recurrent violence of warring factions was such that, quote, the streets were choked with corpses, squares and temples ran with blood. Such an anarchic setting would explain any delay in communication. It would correspond well with Clement's repeated condemnation of revolt, so stasis, which is used 9 times in the epistle, in Corinth, which had likewise laid waste to Rome in this period. Second example, so the nearest example is 5.1. But so that we might cease with the ancient examples, let us come to the nearest that have become athletes. Let us take our generation's noble examples. In 5.1, Clement turns from biblical examples of valor to the nearest to Stengista, who have become athletes, who are, quote, our generation's noble examples, namely Peter and Paul. This passage poses two difficulties for the proposed dating of the mission. First, if this epistle were written in the aftermath of a persecution by Domitian, then it would follow that the Domitianic martyrs in the 90s would be the nearest examples, not Peter and Paul in the 60s. Second, the description of Peter and Paul as our generation's noble examples fits uneasily circa 96 AD, as both figures would have been born around a century earlier and been martyred 30 years prior to Clement's writing. Conversely, a dating 69 or 70 AD fits easily on both accounts. Peter and Paul's martyrs earlier in the 60s would indeed be the nearest examples and would belong to the same generation as Clement and his audience. Third, the temple. Let each of you, brothers, in his own division give thanks to God, being in good conscience, not transgressing the determined rule of his ministry with reverence. Not everywhere, brothers, are the daily sacrifices being offered, or free will offerings, or the offerings for sin and trespasses, but in Jerusalem alone. And there also, not in every place are they offered, but before the holy place at the altar, after the offering has been checked for blemishes through the high priest and the aforementioned ministers. They, therefore, who are doing anything against what is proper by his will, have death as the penalty. You see, brothers, with as much as we are considered worthy of greater knowledge, so much more are we subject to danger. In this passage, Clement appeals to the sacrifices being carried out in the temple in Jerusalem as a demonstration of the proper order God requires. The impression given by this passage is that Clement is writing at a point when the temple still stands and such sacrifices continue to be carried out. Nevertheless, commentators such as Lightfoot have blunted the force of this section with references to passages in Josephus, which was around 93 AD, which also speak of the temple in the present tense. This comparison, however, is substantially weakened on two grounds. First, the notion that it was common to speak of the temple as if it were standing after 70 AD does not easily align with the evidence, either in Josephus or other writers of this period. Josephus's common practice is clear in this regard, and while there are indeed rare passages in his writings which speak of Jerusalem or the temple in the present tense, it is not possible for anyone who reads widely in Josephus to mistake him for an author who writes while the temple is still standing. So anyone who's taken the Josephus seminar can attest to this, because you had to read through the entirety of Josephus's writings. So if you don't believe me, you can ask Joseph back there. As one among many examples, Josephus writes in the mid-70s that the temple and city were so thoroughly destroyed that a passerby would not believe Jerusalem had ever been inhabited. With sources elsewhere, the existence of the temple is one of the clearest temporal indicators we possess for dating a given document. For example, scholars date Barnabas to Baruch and 4 Ezra by its presence or absence. It is curious to appeal for an exception in this case, all to make Clement align with the persecution, which we now doubt ever took place. Second, Clement is not simply speaking of the temple in general, but is appealing to its present activity as the argumentative basis for the similar order God requires in the church. This passage was written around 96 AD, then the response from his opposition is obvious. The temple lies in ruins. The sacrificial system is destroyed, and Clement's argument fares little better. Of course, we should not rule out the possibility that Clement simply offers a terrible argument. But this would sit uneasily with the unanimous testimony that the Corinthian uprising was successfully quelled by Clement's epistle. Our fourth example, deposed elders. Our apostles knew through our Lord Jesus Christ that there would be strife over the name of bishop. On account of this cause, then, Having received perfect foreknowledge, he appointed those previously mentioned, and meanwhile gave them permanence, so that whenever they should fall asleep, there would be a succession of other proven men to their ministry. Therefore, they who have been appointed by those ones, or meanwhile by other reputable men, with all the church joining in approval, and who have ministered blamelessly to the flock of Christ with humility, quietly and unselfishly, and renowned for long times by all, these we consider not rightly to be thrown away from the ministry. Chapter 44 addresses the issue of the elders who had been deposed, both those appointed by the apostles themselves and by others whom they had approved. And Clement counts as blessed those elders who had passed away before the revolt. This passage has been taken by some to support a date in the 90s, since some elders have been appointed by those in succession from the apostles, and others have now died. On the other hand, it would be a surprise if the church in Corinth had not appointed any additional elders by the end of the 60s, especially considering that we have no attestation to Paul returning there after his departure around 56 AD. Further, given that an elder is by definition one who is senior in age, it would not be surprising if at least some of them had died in the 20 years since Paul had founded the church around 50 AD. Particularly considering that average life expectancy in the Roman Empire was well below 50 years. Indeed, if we return to the suggestion of a setting around 96 AD, we see the challenge presented by these figures for the later date. Clement writes that some of those deposed had been personally ordained by the apostles, which presumably would have taken place before Paul's final departure around 56 AD. Though this figure could be slightly extended if other apostles, such as Peter, had traveled through and ordained after this date. For the sake of argument, if we take 56 AD as the latest likely date of ordination, then the Corinthian church would have had elders who ministered for nearly 40 years in 96 AD, a ministry which they only began at an advanced age. This is not impossible, to be sure, since in the early 2nd century, Polycarp attests to have served Christ for 86 years. But it would be rather remarkable and overall represents a less probable scenario. Second, the external evidence. Now, regardless of the internal indicators, there are strong pieces of external evidence that favor a later dating under Domitian. The strongest is the important testimony of Eusebius that Clement served as Bishop of Rome in this period, so from the 12th year of Domitian to the 3rd year of Trajan, so around 91 to 100 AD. Eusebius's chronology coordinates well with the earlier testimony of Irenaeus, who writes that Clement was 3rd in the line of succession after Peter and Paul, with the bishopric first entrusted to Linus and then Cletus. While no absolute dates are provided, a linear succession between these figures would more naturally place Clement later in the century. Thus, my own view at the outset of this project was that the weight of these early sources pushed the external evidence, at least, in favor of the later dating of the epistle. I now believe my assessment of the evidence was incorrect. I still hold that Eusebius, so around 300 AD, presents the strongest piece of evidence for the later date. And that the testimony of Irenaeus, so around 180 AD, slightly favors a later date as well. However, I did not originally account for the relatively late position of Eusebius among patristic testimonies, or his overall lack of sources with respect to Western figures. I also do not account for how the evidence from Irenaeus could be seen as compatible with an earlier date, and further, how Eusebius's drawing of inferences from Irenaeus, one of the few Western sources Eusebius does know, and whom he cites for his list of Roman bishops, could easily have served as a basis for Eusebius's own chronology. More importantly, my initial research did not account for the array of testimonies from the early sources, which present Clement as receiving the position of leadership in the Roman Church directly from Peter at the end of his life. Testimonies which, if based on a historical event, would make Clement's epistle considerably more likely to have been written in the late 60s rather than nearly 3 decades later in the 90s, unless we get into ideas like zombie Peter, which those are hypotheses I'm very open to if we want to discuss that later. To be sure, none of these sources are necessarily contemporaneous with the events, but the fact that one finds this testimony across a diverse body of sources, both geographically and theologically, conveys a sense that they are independent witnesses making reference to a well-known underlying tradition, rather than being dependent on one another as one finds in a game of telephone. The chart on our following slide presents a visual representation of the external testimonies and their relative support for the early or late datings. And here I will briefly note certain of the highlights. So this is a little bit difficult to read, but the way that this chart works is here you have, this is neutral, this is evidence supporting a 69 to 70 dating, so earlier, and then evidence supporting the 95 to 96 dating later. And this goes chronologically. So here we start with the earliest sources, we go down. So here you can see you have Irenaeus, which I think slightly supports the later date. You can see this who clearly supports the later date. Then you have all of these other sources over here, which when I actually line them up, I found that they did not align with what I originally thought the correct assessment of the evidence to be. Now, this isn't that nice to look at, and so I made a nicer one. This is the nicer one, which we get to look at a map. So this is the geographic distribution. So as I mentioned, we're not just dealing with a number of sources and saying this many say this many say this. We're also looking at the times in which we say this, the theological, I guess you could say, disposition, the theological orientation of the people who are saying this. So is one source likely to be dependent on another? Or are these in some way in opposition to one another so that their testimony would, in some way, if they agree on this point, it would sort of add extra points for it. And then how the sources are distributed geographically from one another. So is it just people in one location that are saying this, or is this pretty widespread geographically? So I'll take you through certain of these highlights. North Africa, so Tertullian around 200 AD, writing a century before Eusebius, Tertullian mentions Peter ordaining Clement as his successor in Rome as a guarantor of the genuine faith. So you can see this one right over here. Syria, Palestine, the pseudo-Clementines, so around 150 to 200 AD. The provenance and historicity of these writings is very difficult to trace, though most interpreters agree that they are either authored by Ebionites or have Ebionite interpolations. They are prefixed to the by the letter of Clement to James, which Lightfoot dates to around 150 to 200 AD, which tells the story of Peter ordaining Clement to be his successor. This seems very unlikely to be dependent on Tertullian or vice versa, based on their geographic distance and Tertullian's opposition to what he calls, quote, the heresy of Ebion. Next, the Apostolic Constitution. So this is written around 360 AD, though it's made up of earlier sources. Book 7 states as follows. Now, concerning those bishops which have been ordained in our lifetime, we let you know that they are these. Of the church in Rome, Linus, the son of Claudia, was the first ordained by Paul, and Clemens, after Linus' death, the second ordained by me, Peter. So this is Peter himself speaking in his own voice, which can be presumed to be a non-zombie voice, saying, I have ordained Peter to be my successor. And Linus was somewhere there earlier, but it's still a direct succession to Clement. The Apostolic Constitutions themselves are made up of earlier sources, though it is very difficult to trace how far back this tradition goes. In any case, given their opposition to the Ebionites, which we have in Book 6, the Apostolic Constitutions, seems very unlikely that they are dependent on the pseudo-Clementine writings. So those are these two over here. So approximately over here, although placing these geographically with any precision is very difficult. Then finally, Rome, the Liberian catalog, so around 230 AD. A list of Roman bishops from 354, the former section of which Lightfoot dates to around 230, and which dates Clement's episcopate in Rome from 68 to 76 AD. Its chronology is somewhat perplexing, as it appears to date Peter's transfer of authority to Linus to 55 AD. My reading of this source is that it intends to say that Linus was installed by Peter as the head of the Roman Church from 55 to 67 AD, after whose death Peter ordained Clement as his successor in 67 AD, before Peter's own death in 68. If nothing else, the apparent idiosyncrasy of the Liberian catalog seems to indicate its independence from other sources. Then finally, Jerome, this is on illustrious men, it's around 390, so here we have our two sources here. Jerome follows Eusebius's chronology for Clement's life, but then adds, quote, although most of the Latins think that Clement was second after the apostle. The statement seems unlikely to be dependent on the sources noted above, as it is described as being based on the testimony of the Latins themselves. The first half of Jerome's career was spent in Rome, where, among other duties, he served as Pope Damasus's personal secretary. And so his testimony is likely derived from his own knowledge of the Roman Church's written records, as reflected later in the Liber Pontificalis, etc. For the sake of argument, let us imagine that Eusebius's history and Jerome's on illustrious men were our only two witnesses on this question. So Eusebius' history over here, Jerome on illustrious men right here. Would we presume the precise sequence of Roman succession to have been better preserved by Eusebius in Palestine or by the Romans themselves? The Romans' possession of their own records would naturally suggest their precedence here, just as Eusebius's access to records in Caesarea does the same in Eastern matters. The fact that so many non-Roman sources are found to corroborate this testimony of the Latins serves to illustrate the strength of this position relative to the Eusebian chronology. Third, historical correspondences. As with all historical judgments, we are still dealing here with relative probabilities, with my estimation being that the internal and external evidence for the early date is stronger in both cases. I did not expect to say more than this in my study until I was pressed with more evidence by a student from DSBT, the retired lawyer James Shannon, who I really wish could be here, is unable to make it today. I think he's in Europe, so he had a good excuse. No, I think he's in South Africa. That's the even better excuse. Likewise persuaded by the evidence for the earlier date, he pressed me on 3 points. First, Dr. Shannon drew attention to the fact that the early church in Corinth was far more Jewish than many commentators, including myself, were recognizing. The case for this is compelling. Paul's ministry in Corinth in the 50s first takes place in the synagogue, and then next door to the synagogue, together with the former synagogue leader, Crispus. And the proconsul Gallio clearly perceives the development of the church as an internal Jewish affair. This is Acts 18:15. These deep Jewish roots allowed Clement to cite Israel's scriptures freely to an audience which he acknowledges knows them very well, and for whom their testimony offers the key authority throughout his argumentation. Second, the Emperor Nero had spent much of AD 68 in Corinth, and Josephus writes that 6,000 Jewish slaves, handpicked by Vespasian for their youth and strength, were sent to the city to dig through the Corinthian isthmus after being captured in the Jewish war. With Nero's death in June 68 and the project's abandonment, some number of these prisoners of war would certainly have been absorbed into Corinth's Jewish community. Judging by the insurrections instigated by veterans of the Jewish war in cities like Alexandria and Cyrene, what would the impact of these soldiers have been in Corinth? Third, it's curious, in all 65 chapters of the epistle, Clement never directly identifies the nature of the conflict within the Corinthian church. To be sure, Clement notes certain qualities of the offending figures, such as their youth, but never states the ground for their revolt. Was this perhaps due to political sensitivities in Corinth that made speaking openly of the circumstances impossible? Would it be possible to read between the lines of Clement's letter to learn any more of the conflict? When I returned to the Greek text, I found the answer staring me in the face. In the opening chapters of the epistle, there is one quality which Clement repeatedly highlights for special condemnation, zelos. Indeed, in no other writing from antiquity have I found this word to be singled out with anything like the frequency found in First Clement, whether Christian, Jewish, or pagan. This word can be translated as both zeal and jealousy, and my translation had originally opted for jealousy without much reflection, though English editions of the New Testament roughly divide occurrences between the two. However, in nearly all of Clement's references to zelos, the issue at hand is not simply covetousness, though this is often present, but an opposition which is marked by violence or insurrection, as with the cognate adjective zelotes, zealot. Clement's condemnation of zeal is especially pronounced in the epistle's opening section, bookended by the assertion that zeal leads to death. Zelos is employed 17 times in 1 Clement 3 through 9, including the following examples of its pernicious history and effects. What I've done so that you can see what this looks like, I've taken a section of this. So this was 1 Clement 7:13, and then I'll take you through 6, just so you can see the degree of emphasis that this has. It's almost pretty much every sentence in these sections begins with zeal and condemning zeal. So this is the way the section runs. He begins in 3/4 with basically the thesis of our section. Zeal leads to death. Zeal produced Cain's murder of Abel. Because of zeal, Esau threatened Jacob's life. Zeal caused Joseph to be persecuted to the point of death and slavery. Zeal forced Moses to flee after killing the Egyptian. On account of zeal, Aaron and Miriam rose up against Moses. Zeal led Dathan and Abiram to revolt and die. Due to zeal, David's life was sought both by the Philistines and King Saul. We'll go on here. This is chapter 5. Because of zeal, Peter was persecuted and put to death. On account of zeal, Paul likewise suffered many torments and was killed. Because of zeal, women were tortured and killed as Danates and Dirke. Zeal estranged wives from husbands. Zeal destroyed great cities and uprooted great nations. And then finally closing the section in 9:1, zeal leads to death. While Clement never openly states the nature of the conflict with the opponents in Corinth, we can see that the rebels are young, relatively few within the church, guided in some way by the Jewish scriptures, and driven by their zeal to strife and revolt. What Clement does make clear at the outset of his epistle, with an emphasis without evident parallel in ancient writings, is that the zeal of these opponents is contrary to God's purposes and will lead only to destruction. How would such a response fit in the context of what we know about Corinth circa 67 to 70 AD? If written in this period, Clement would be in no way exaggerating when he associates the zealous opposition with war and captivity, and the consequences of following them as, quote, no common harm, but rather a great danger, particularly as the Corinthian revolt had now become known to the church's enemies. Take the example in Alexandria. The Jewish temple in Leontopolis was destroyed by the Romans due to the influence of Jewish rebels who had fled there from the war, which took place even with the Alexandrian Jews largely rejecting the revolt. In Cyrene, the influence of one escaped Sicarii, Jonathan, led to 3,000 Jews being put to death by the Roman governor. Within such a historical setting, Clement's epistle would not be an artifact of an abstract debate over ecclesiology between the Corinthian and Roman churches, as if the root issue were a conflict between embryonic Presbyterians and Episcopalians, but rather a real crisis which put the existence of both in danger by a possible association with those in revolt. Now, it is important to state that I do not regard the dating of First Clement in this period as a certainty, and it is not presented as such in what follows. What can be said in summary of my analysis is this. 1, that the internal evidence of First Clement strongly favored him circa 69-70 AD. 2, that the external evidence, though varied, is also most consistent with the date in this same period. 3, that the contents of First Clement correspond remarkably well with the testimony of other historical sources regarding the events that took place in Corinth circa 67 to 70 AD. Of course, it is also important to not understate the weight of evidence which supports this conclusion. It is true that it may be only coincidental that Clement's letter to the Corinthians is suggested by internal and external indicators to have been written near the end of a disastrous zealot-led war. That 6,000 prisoners of this war were dispersed this very moment in Corinth, and that Clement's letter happens to contain the most sustained and emphatic condemnation of zeal that is found in ancient writings. But it would be a rather remarkable set of coincidences. As with all historical judgments, we are dealing here in relative probabilities, not certainties. But in my estimation, the convergence of evidence we have, which places First Clement in this particular historical setting, is more substantial than we have for most other ancient writings, including most of those which comprise the New Testament. The fact that the most popular alternative, the Domitian persecution hypothesis, is now regarded by so many as insecure, only serves to strengthen the early date's relative probability. In conclusion, to return to our original question, what does all this mean for the two competing traditions regarding the order of succession from St. Peter? The focus of my research has been to identify as accurately as possible the likeliest historical setting of First Clement, and it's not my aim to offer any kind of definitive judgment on how this would relate to a broader history of the early bishops of Rome. However, since it is impossible to avoid the implications that the first line of inquiry holds for the second, I will here offer a brief statement on how my studies in First Clement have influenced my view of this matter. History preserves two general positions on Clement's place in the Roman succession. One, represented most prominently by Eusebius, which sees him elevated to the episcopacy in a line of succession decades after Peter's death, and another held by, quote, most of the Latins, which sees him as receiving the succession directly from Peter himself. My studies in First Clement have inclined me to the view that the second of these is correct. What would this mean for Linus and Cletus, the two figures traditionally named before Clement in the Roman succession? The scenario I came to suspect during my research was that these figures would have served as leaders in Rome during the lifetime of the apostles, not unlike the real but still subordinate authority held by a modern suffragan or auxiliary bishop. It was thus a very welcome surprise to find that Rufinus of Aquileia, in a period when he was active in Rome, so this is around 406 AD, reports precisely the same scenario as the tradition he had received, so this is Rufinus. But I do not think it out of place to explain here what will perhaps seem to some to be inconsistent. For since Linus and Cletus were bishops in the city of Rome before this Clement, how could Clement himself, writing to James, say that the chair of teaching was handed over to him by Peter? Now we have heard this explanation, that Linus and Cletus were indeed bishops in the city of Rome before Clement, but during the lifetime of Peter. That is, they undertook the care of the episcopate, and that he fulfilled the office of apostleship, as is found also to have been the case at Caesarea, when he himself was present, he yet had Zacchaeus ordained by himself as bishop. In this way, both statements will appear to be true, both that these bishops are reckoned before Clement, and yet that Clement received the teacher's seat on the death of Peter. Such a scenario would account both for the consistency of the attestation to Linus and Cletus in early episcopal lists, as well as the fact that so little is known of either of them. While the apostles themselves were still active, they would naturally have drawn less interest than them, while the first figure after the apostles' departure would naturally hold greater prominence. This is precisely what is found in our earliest record, that of Irenaeus, who says of Linus only that he was mentioned in Paul's epistle to Timothy, and of his successor, virtually nothing. Here's the quote, and Cletus succeeded him. There's the entry. These descriptions are dwarfed by Irenaeus' section on Clement, which stretches for nearly 10 times the length of his combined testimony to Linus and Cletus. Now, are there any alternative reconstructions which could also provide a satisfying account for our evidence? One proposal has been advanced by Thomas Heron, who suggests that Clement's epistle is indeed written early, so around 69 AD, but that Clement served as a sort of foreign secretary in this period, and only inherited Rome's bishopric later under Domitian. In my estimation, such a scenario is not impossible, for a few reasons is unlikely. First, the author clearly holds an authoritative posture in the epistle, with 8 different verbs employed that refer to commands or direction, in a clear sense that he speaks with the authority of the entire church, and indeed as God's own mouthpiece, which is explicit in chapters 59 and 63. This is written by a secretary. We must suspect him to be a megalomaniac. Second, the task of responding to the crisis in Corinth is not one that seems likely to have been delegated to a secondary authority, nor one that could have been effectively met by a figure whose authority was not clearly established. And third, that Clement is only a subordinate in the Roman Church at the time of writing, and not its principal leader. The Church of Rome must already have possessed such a singular authority that even its foreign secretaries could issue commands to other churches and expect for them to be obeyed. Yet we know from elsewhere that Roman primacy did not function in so straightforward a manner. For instance, when in the mid-2nd century, Pope Anicetus himself sought to persuade Polycarp and the Quartodeciman churches to conform to the more widely held date for celebrating Easter, the best he could achieve was a fraternal agreement to disagree. Beyond this alternative, it is noteworthy how difficult it is to find satisfying explanations for our widespread testimony to Clement's direct succession of Peter, which is the case even among the best of commentators. This is perhaps best exemplified by Lightfoot, who suggests the following, here I quote directly: "This story," so that is of Peter ordaining Clement, "was so flattering to the corporate pride of the Roman Christians and the unique position it assigned to Clement that it rapidly spread and largely influenced popular opinion in Rome." While Lightfoot carries the stature without parallel among commentators, we must acknowledge that this is a remarkably bad argument. It does not account for the fact that the belief is widespread in non-Roman sources, nor, more obviously, that Linus and Cletus were also Roman Christians, and so would have been just as flattering to Roman corporate pride as the heirs of Peter. Finally, what would the potential implications be of our proposed conclusions? It seems to me that there's likely an apologetic significance to establishing the Petrine succession with greater clarity, though others will be able to comment on this better than I. A related question is how Clement's epistle seems to establish the early date of Peter's writings, as at least 1 Peter is commonly acknowledged to be a source in Clement's own theology. A third area is ecclesiological. It is interesting that in the 8th century, Saint Bede, who also holds to this view on the Roman succession, cites the precedent of Peter appointing Clement as his successor while he was still alive for the similar practices that took place in the early days of the English Church. However, given that this is a St. Albert's seminar and not a St. Albert's lecture, I here open up the floor to you, our audience, to discuss whether these conclusions are indeed judged to be most likely, and if so, what their significance might be for questions also.
All right, we have about 15 minutes or so for questions and comments. Maybe I'll go first then. So I'm not super familiar with the literature on this fund, but the little bit that I have encountered, it has been generally taken for granted, as you've illustrated, that the later date. Now, Is that just because Eusebius has been the sort of the too much weight has been given to his testimony?
Yeah.
And then is it true that as his testimony has been recognized to be less reliable in other respects, it sort of parallels the challenge on this particular issue?
Yeah, so I would say there's a couple of things going on. One, I think that there is, I mean, Eusebius' testimony is influential. I think that he is really valuable as a historical source. But I think it's also, and here, anybody who, spends a good time, reading Eusebius will see, Eusebius isn't equally strong on all matters. There's certain areas where Eusebius does really know quite a lot, and it is really helpful and reliable, where he has fantastic sources. And there's others where he's just less good, and particularly with respect to the Western Church, he just has less knowledge, he has less access. And so it's one of the things when you read through the history, there's very few Latin sources that are represented. It really is a story which is told from, really with kind of Jerusalem and Judea at the center, which is, he was writing from Caesarea, makes sense. And so he is a little bit less strong in those areas. And so I think it's helpful then to, read Eusebius critically and say, where are we going to take him to be on stronger historical ground, and where, by his own admission, does he just know a little bit less? I don't know if that's the entire thing that's going on. I would say that there's, I wish that biblical studies and early Christian studies were completely non-ideological disciplines at the academic level, and I find that that's not always the case. And so there can be a, let me put it this way, for those who will probably encounter this, there can be this pull at an academic level to date sources later. That just often tends to be something that, from an academic standpoint, we put it this way, as an academic, nobody's ever scared of dating something too late for fear of what people are going to think. And, if you say, hey, this is actually written in the 17th century, people, really? If you put anything too early, there's a decent chance that people are gonna start raising their eyebrow, actually say, what's going on here? What's the nature of this? And so I would say the general gravity that seems to function within academic, biblical studies, academic early Christian studies, is to pull you towards later dates. Regardless of whether or not that particular dating is best supported by the evidence. Now, from a standpoint of, if you're the kind of person that, your disposition is such that you say, yeah, I wouldn't really know a whole lot about early Christianity. We don't really know a whole lot about the apostles and Peter and Paul. We don't really know what happened to them. We don't really know anything. So we don't have to really worry about it very much. I could see how having First Clement written 69, 70 AD might be a little bit uncomfortable for you. Because here he's referring to Peter and Paul's martyrdoms and saying, these things just happened. These are the most recent examples of martyrdom that took place here in our own generation. Let's think about this. Well, if that's the case, it turns out that we actually know quite a bit more on a more decent historical footing about, early Christians, about the apostles, about all these kinds of things. Than we might have thought that we did. That's not necessarily a draw for everybody. And that's just, I think, the reality of what biblical studies at the academic level is often like. So I'll just say, I think I would be, I think I would be remiss if I did acknowledge that that's at least in the water sometimes when you're dealing with this. If you've got an early date or a late date, your kind of more skeptical folks are almost always going to go towards the late date. Those who are maybe not more skeptical, but are circumspect in recognizing, this is the nature of the discipline that we're in, they're only going to go for an early date if they feel like there's a really, really good case for it. So at least that's something that I've experienced internally in this. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. There's a couple over here.
Did I understand that you said that St. Peter, or the first letter of Peter, is clearly referenced in?
Yeah.
So that seems to me like one of the biggest things at stake here is because if it is, and if Clement is writing in the late 60s, like that makes the case for Petra and authorship
Yeah.
very strong, because you know you can only imitate an author. I mean,
Yeah.
if the author's still alive when you write it,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
like that's a lot harder to get away with.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. So I would agree with that. I mean, depending on how spicy you want to get, there's commentators that have identified influence from Second Peter, and
Really? Well, that would be a huge. That would be
I know
size
it depends on how much I'm gonna up the spice level here. So my own view, I think that the use of First Peter is
uncontroversial.
as absolutely clear in
Is it?
First Clement. Second Peter, I think that you can interpret it more than one way. Interestingly, I think it's actually Lightfoot who looks at there's gotta be some relationship between Second Peter and First Clement. And so yeah, it might be a little bit less clear than First Peter though.
I'm rusty on this, but if I recall, hardly anybody defends Petra authorship, even of First Peter. Not that many.
I mean, I do, but
I
wasn't here when you were speaking, so.
Am I wrong to say you're in the minority though?
So it's a challenge. That's one of those things where I would say that there's been a bit of a shift in the discipline. Just as I don't know, people who are like really hardcore skeptics, people just get bored of reading them. Like it's so easy to just say, oh, that's not authentic, that's inauthentic. It's like that doesn't actually explain a whole lot historically.
Yeah.
And so who I studied with at Oxford, Marcus Bachfield, he has a really great study on Second Peter. He just gives a really straightforward case, like on any normal historical grounds. Like First Peter is so widely attested in the church, it would be almost without precedent. Really would be without precedent to have an inauthentic writing, which was so universally accepted as authentic, not just in terms of kind of biblical studies, but for any ancient writing. Yeah, you talk about Second Peter from up. It depends on how high you want the spice level. You will let Brother John be on you. That.
All the spice level.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a question about, yeah, I find your own development of like your opinion about this interesting too. Like it seems hopeful. Like you thought Eusebius and Irenaeus lining up was really convincing, and then changed your mind. It seemed like mostly because of the apostolic constitutions, which on your chart you list as like 4th century, but you were kind of mentioning it's full of sources from much earlier than that. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So we usually date the apostolic constitutions around 360 AD. But when you're reading the apostolic constitutions, which is actually really enjoyable if you like this kind of thing, it's kind of large and it takes some time. But if you take the time to get into it, you see it's actually made up of earlier stuff like the Didache. So if you've read through the Didache, you're going to find that in the apostolic constitutions. If you've read like the Didaskalia Apostolorum, which is another delightful document. And so this isn't, I would say the apostolic constitutions isn't necessarily like, hey, this is like some sort of straightforward forgery in the sense of like, hey, let's imitate the apostles. We're going to fool everybody. It's going to be great. Which I mean, seems like a fun thing to do, but I'm not certain that's exactly what's going on in that, because it really is a text which is a synthesis of a lot of these earlier, manuals of church discipline. But again, as far as that precise tradition that you have within the apostolic constitutions, where that one comes from, I think it's just really difficult to state. And so that's why for me, the apostolic constitutions just by themselves wouldn't be extremely, weight, even though I think it's still an important source. It's more that you have the convergence of all of these sources, which you see here, which are pretty widely distributed, and which are often theologically at odds with one another and other areas.
Can you say something about Irenaeus? Because I mean, he is relatively early and he is not exactly from the East.
Yeah.
And for him, that succession question is an important one.
Yeah.
So can you recap again? What did he say? And
Yeah. So Irenaeus gives us the names. Irenaeus does not give us dates. So he says, here you've got Linus, Cletus, Clement. And so if you're reading this and you already have the Eusebian framework in mind, and you're trying to intuit what's he mean here? I would say it's somewhat natural in terms of the way succession normally works, to say, okay, this is There's probably one to the next, to the next, to the next. But it doesn't actually say that explicitly. He says, here's Peter, you got Peter and Paul, they lay the foundation of the Church of Rome, and then you Linus, Cletus, says basically nothing about them. And then he gives this long thing on Clement and talks about Clement and how Clement was actually a disciple of both apostles, that he was an associate of them. He had their preaching still ringing in his ears, and all these kinds of things. So it is one of those things where if you hold to the date that most of the Latins hold to as well, it's not incompatible with what Irenaeus is saying, because again, Irenaeus doesn't tell you how the succession works. He doesn't give you, dates, anything like that. He just gives you a list. If you were just to take the list and say, hey, what's your guess based on this? You had no other evidence to go for it. You'd probably guess like a linear succession. But again, we're drawing inferences either way. Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yes.
So some brothers know that I love very much the golden legend of the Dominican and historian, Blessed James of Origin. And he gives another option, and I wonder what to think of that.
Yeah.
He believed that Saint Peter, when it was the time of his passion, ordained and gave his seat to Clement.
Yeah.
And after that, Clement, by humility and also because he had in great esteem Len and Cletus, and also because he wanted that for the rest of the history, the seat would not be acquired in that way, but by good election. So he gave his seat as elected, and then there was Len and Cletus, and then he came back on the seat later on.
Yeah, absolutely. So that the golden legend actually doesn't make that up. So you have that. The first attestation that you have to that is in Epiphanius. So this is around 400 AD. Epiphanius, it's interesting because he's like transparent. He says, I don't know how this works. he says some people say that, there's a straightforward succession. Other people say that he was actually first. I don't know which one is true. But he says if there was something where there was Linus and Cletus still somehow intervene there between, so that doesn't come to it. So he kind of has the Eusebian chronology in mind, but he also has the story of the direct ordination. He's trying to think, how would you make this make sense if you are taking this Eusebian chronology as like baseline? This must be accurate, and that's the scenario that Epiphanius suggests. Like maybe this is what happened. Like maybe Peter ordained him, and then he went and said, "Oh no, I can't do it. Sorry, guys. You gotta get Linus instead." And then Linus and Cletus come in, and then he sort of comes afterwards and jumps in there. So I think that the golden legend there is based on Epiphanius, which is, again, you can see how these early figures are looking at the data and trying to intuit what's actually going on here. And so this is why I think trying to do like a really synthetic thing in terms of looking at all of the internal data from First Clement, all of the testimonies that we have, which might have any kind of relevance, and then saying what actually was happening historically at this moment in Corinth. And it turns out there were very, very big events happening in Corinth, which correspond very well with the issues that Clement is encountering there. Brother Brian?
Yeah, thank you for the talk, Matthew. So I'm putting on my display maybe my ignorance and maybe my lack of attention span, but it's a question about how you're going about this and maybe how this could be an example for others. So the question is, when you list the internal evidence, you've got four big passages there.
Yeah.
Were there any that you left out? Like some that may argue for your point, or maybe more spicily, some that may argue for the other.
Yeah.
We consider really all of them.
Yeah. So what this is a synthesis of a larger section. And I took the four most relevant points. It's interesting because actually some of the ones that I included. So the first point and the fourth point are 2 points which are most often mentioned on the other side of the argument. So they're mentioned as pieces of evidence for the dating under Domitian in the 90s. But then the more that folks really stop and look at these things and think, how would this work exactly? What happened with Domitian? Wait, was there even a persecution? Which again is a good question. That's not just some sort of, there's certain flavors of kind of, doubting the myth of persecution, things like that, saying that, Christians when he created this, later on kind of make himself look cool by dying. I don't know. It's interesting because this isn't really an example of that. This is just looking closely at our, the earliest historical sources, because Tertullian says, yeah, Domitian tried this once, and then he stopped because he wasn't that bad. He wasn't really bad the way that Nero was. And so that's the interesting thing I've actually included here. So this, and then point 4. So the deposed elders, and the idea that some of these are from the apostles and some of these are subsequently, they succeeded to the office. They're probably the 2 most frequently cited in favor of the later date. And I just think if you really spend time with both of those, they don't really actually support the later date in the way that you might think at first glance, or even as I thought at first glance. So, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that.
We're probably gonna have to end it there. Nice to say thank you.